Hey guys, welcome back to the channel and thanks for joining me again. Today we're going to continue on with our blues rhythm playing studies and take a good close look at T-Bone Walker's Stormy Monday. This is one of those classic progressions that will undoubtedly get called up at any blues jam that you go to. Call it a blues standard, if you will. Still in a 12-bar format, but with some elevated chord changes and a few jazzy touches, this flavour of the blues tastefully straddles that line between dirty and sophisticated. As always, you can get hold of the thorough lesson materials at the links in the description. You'll get all 4 pages of these examples neatly typed out in tab and notation in Guitar Pro and PDF formats. For the cost of a couple of cups of coffee per month, you can join my Patreon where you'll get access to every single lesson I've ever done. That's well over a year's worth of weekly lessons plus a ton of bonus stuff as well. Or if you just want this one lesson in particular, you can go to the Gumroad link. Either way, I really appreciate your support. Okay, so let's jump in and take a look at our basic starting point, the template that we're going to build upon. We'll also highlight how and where this differs from your regular 12-bar blues progressions. We're in the key of G and we're starting on the 1 chord, and for now we'll go with something simple, just a G7 bar chord at the 3rd fret. Then in the 2nd bar we go to the 4 chord. Now you could play a C7, or you can extend it right off the bat with a 9th, so a C7 3-note voicing plus the 9. The chord name now becomes C9, but we know in the back of our mind that it's a C7 with an extension. Now we go back to the 1. This is where in a normal 12-bar blues you'd expect to just have 2 bars on the 1. But here we do this T-Bone Walker sidestep upper semitone to G sharp and back. And then typical of a normal 12-bar blues, in bars 5 and 6 we go back to the 4 chord. So again you can be thinking C7, or any kind of dominant chord, so like a C9 again maybe, for 2 bars. And then in bar number 7, again just like a typical 12-bar blues, we're going to go back to the 1, but where this starts to differ is we only do 2 beats there, and then we begin this little climb through a bunch of minor 7th chords. We go A minor 7, B minor 7, and then B flat minor 7. So nice and easy. You can use these bar chords if you want, or you can use these jazzy voicings, 2nd finger on the low string playing the root, the A string is being killed, totally damped out, 3rd finger barring strings D, G and B, and perhaps even bringing the top E in now and then. That's the minor 7 voicing I tend to prefer most of the time. It's a horses for courses thing as always. Some things will require you to play it this way, some moves work best this way. So experiment. So just to recap, bars 7 and 8, G7, A minor 7, B minor 7, B flat minor 7. Now in bar number 9, A minor 7 for a whole bar. And then we'll go kind of Allman Brothers in flavour to begin with, and take this up 3 frets to a C minor 7, before resolving back to G7. And now we're into a turnaround. So you've got your G7, your C7, G7, D7. So typical 1-4, 1-5 turnaround. I'm going to play through that whole thing at 60 BPM with my metronome. Nice slow groove. 3, 4. So that's our starting point, our blank canvas. Now let's start to look at alternative voicings for some of those chords. So as we spoke about, like with the C7, where we can extend it to a C9, let's look at doing a similar thing with the G7 chord. So G7, bar chord at the 3rd fret. Again, like with the minor 7s I showed you, we could always opt for this more sort of jazz typical voicing, which frees up a finger for other things, which can be really useful. This would be thumb over at the 3rd fret, and again, dead A string. frets 3, 4, 3 from the D string down. You could also do that without the thumb if you prefer, and use all 4 fingers. So that's another option for a G7 voicing. You've also, of course, got this G7 voicing, sort of the Beatles one. So that's where you're doubling the flat 7 up on the B string here. But now what if we want G9? Okay, in this position there's a few ways you could do it. One option would be to take your G7 and simply add the 9, courtesy of the 5th fret of the top E string. But that's not all that common, unless you're playing more of a comping roll where you're doing these little chord stabs. That stuff sounds great, but if you're a rhythm player, you'll probably want to find a voicing that has that 9 buried a little deeper within the chord. So let's take this shape here. Looks like a B minor 7 flat 5. It is a B minor 7 flat 5, but it's also a rootless G9 chord. If we're thinking G9, here's your 3rd, your flat 7, your 9 and your 5th. The root could always be added with the thumb if you like. Or you can also do the Kenny Burrell option of bringing the root in on the top string by borrowing that little finger. Either way, it takes a bit of practice. You could always try and get all 6. Nice thing to have under your fingers. And of course you can always break those bigger shapes into smaller chunks, not only this side of the chord, but if you wanted to, you could take the top 4 strings of this and have this kind of a shape. Pretty common to see that as well. On that same idea, you could also have the 9 in that upper register with a G7 supporting it underneath from the D string down. You've got lots of options basically. Now if you're on a dominant chord that already contains the flat 7, you've extended it now with the 9, where else can you go? You could add a 13 if you like. G13. That's root, flat 7, 3rd, 13. Same thing as a 6, but in dominant chord language, we have to call it a 13. You could always add the 9 on top of that as well. Doesn't change the name of the chord. When you say G13, it almost implies that thered be a 9 in there somewhere. Another really nice option, isn't it? Especially if you want to walk down to your 4 chord. C9 works really well. Bit of tritone sub. But let's explore that stuff in a moment. Now let's look at the alternative voicings we could use for C7. We've already looked at this as a starting point, and the C9 as a sort of an elevated version of that. You can always choose, by the way, here whether you want to hear just 4 strings or whether you want to bar the top string and bring that in. Let that stuff be dictated by the texture and the tonality that you want to hear. Don't just think one or the other in some arbitrary way. Let your ears tell you which one to go for. Now, like with the G9 that we had, that rootless one, if you were to take this C9 and remove the root, look what you've got. E minor 7 flat 5. Move that to the A string, and we're back onto that shape that we used for the G9 down here. So there's C9 rooted on the A string, or not rooted, sorry, but major 3rd on the A string, constructed off there. Always possible to add the root if you want, again like we discussed earlier, or the root on top, or that small portion of this stuff on the top 4 strings. Lots of options. C13 as well, of course. All good stuff. Now, as far as the A minor 7 goes, we already looked at these 2 options here. So you've got the standard bar chord off the low E string, that's your full E shape A minor 7 bar chord, or you can remove the A string from the equation, lifting that 5th an octave to the B string by just leaving that string out and muting it. That's kind of like we said, the jazz way of doing it. And of course that applies to all of your minor 7ths. The B minor 7, you can do the same thing. B flat minor 7, A minor 7, C minor 7 as well, of course. All of them. Now later on we're also going to look at a way that completely substitutes that second A minor 7 chord, so stick around. Okay, now what about our 5 chord, the D7? Let's look at some options there. You've got this typical D7 voicing here, which always works really nicely. Of course, you've always got this bar chord on the other side of that. As a side note, I always like to have one option either side of a root note. Nice simple way of looking at it. You've got the root note here, and you've got one option to the right, and one option to the left. What you'll more typically hear, in Stormy Monday especially, is the augmented chord, so like a D7 with a sharpened 5th kind of tonality. If we just play a D augmented, that does that job for us beautifully. So this is the root, the 3rd, the sharpened 5th, and then the root again. So nothing but a D augmented triad really. I also think of this one as a little bit of a Beatlesy sounding chord. course, it goes way back to the blues and jazz stuff of old. Now, in for a penny, in for a pound, right? We've altered that fifth by sharpening it. Why don't we alter the ninth? So you could be thinking D9, but sharpen it. D7 sharp 9, the famous Hendrix chord. Or you could go flat 9, right? So to the other side. You could do both. Creates a nice little leading line back to the 1. Okay, so those are some options for alternate voicings you can use for these chords. Now let's get on to adding some movement. So this cool little thing. I always called this the Memphis Slide. I don't know why. Maybe it sounds like it came from Memphis. So for the purposes of today's lesson, let's go with that. So the Memphis Slide, you're thinking of a G9 as your destination chord. So take that voicing we had here, but remove the A string, and now you've got this 3-note triad, right? Which really is a D minor triad, hiding in plain sight. You're going to start a whole tone higher, E minor, slide to D minor. You can go between them. You can do chromatic movement, any of that really cool stuff. If you don't have to hold down all of the rhythm duties, if you have a bass player holding down that G in the bass, you can get away with nothing but that. You can just go. But when you're playing solo guitar, it's nice to fill it out a little bit. So I just always want to put the root in there on beat 1. 1, 2, and 3. And then on beat 4, I might do a chord stab that focuses on the top 3 strings mostly, or maybe the top 4 strings. Take that voicing we had earlier, extend it with the top E string, and you're onto that 4-note voicing of a G9. So you'd have root, slidey stuff, and then stab on beat 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. This little sidestep into the root as well is really useful. We can sidestep as much as we want with this stuff, really. Notice how I like to palm mute the bass notes as well. Check out my Change Is Gonna Come video, where we get into that sort of soul groove and how to get the texture just right. You could also play this on the last 3 fingers, which gives you the chance to bring in the top string if you want. For that T-Bone semitone movement on the 1 chord, that little sidestep that he does in bar number 3, you can always go to a 13th chord. That sounds really good as well, right? So G7, C9, back to the G7, but then G sharp 13, G7. Now when we go to the 4 chord, of course you can just carry all of this stuff up to the 8th fret and repeat. Or you can drop down to that next string set and use the top 3 strings. Because it's the same voicing, right? Take the same approach. It's easier there because you can just bar with the 3rd finger. And you can get playful with this sort of stuff. So those were static bits of movement that you can feel free to add anytime you're on a dominant chord. But now let's look at some function-specific movements. So let's navigate from 1 to 4 and look at a few common ways to do it. One of the ways that I really like is to think of your G9 here and just literally walk it chromatically up to C9. You just got to time it correctly. And it tends to work best in bar number 4. So I'm going to use that in bar number 4. And in bar number 3, I'm going to chuck some sidestepping in, T-Bone Walker style, on this G9 rootless voicing. Check it out. 3, 4. Hear the way it walks us to the C9? Works beautifully, doesn't it? Now another thing that I really like to do when we transition from the 1 chord to the 4 chord is this thing that I think of as a bit of an Otis Rush kind of move, where you walk chromatically to the major 3rd of the chord, Check out his live version of I Can't Quit You Baby, and you'll hear that plenty of times. Sounds really cool. G7 to C9. Rather than doing the root note, you're focusing on the third. You could do it on both the chords. There's G9. There's C9. Targeting the third. It sounds so cool. T-bone movement. Chromatic. So many variables. Now of course you can take that sidestepping thing to the next level and just simply chuck it into complete chord movements. So you could play G7 walking into it from below, C7 or C9 walking in from below. You could also do them from above. You can sidestep from any direction at any time, as long as you're thinking in semitones. Look at where you want to end up. Start a semitone lower or a semitone higher. It's up to you. Play around with those things. Now another really nice movement to get from the 1 to the 4 is something we kind of hinted at earlier. G13, then flatten the 13, and then connect that down to the C9. Beautiful bit of movement. And again, I'd typically put that into bar 4 so it resolves onto beat 1 of bar 5. You could also tritone sub the bass. When you go for this here, swap the bass note from G to C sharp. And now look what you've got. C sharp 9. Which really is just a fancy way of saying sidestep. Again, from above. So tritone sub is just a glorified sidestep a lot of the time. Do remember that I teach 9 private lessons on Zoom every single day. So if you want to book in for one of them, you can go to the TidyCal link in the description. Choose your slot. It does all the time zone conversion for us, and you can prepay, and we meet on the day. You get all of the lesson materials emailed to you, as well as a video of the lesson itself. Really good way to get instant answers to all of those nagging questions you might have, or if you're struggling to get some structure in your practice and you want to be held accountable, I'm here for that. Now let's get on to the most complicated portion of this progression, where we have a ton of options available to us, and everyone seems to do this differently, and that's a great thing. We want as many options as we can find. This is bars 9 to 11 of the progression. This is where in our original template we would have had this. A minor 7 for 1 bar, to the C minor 7, that's the 4 minor we call it, and then back to the 1 to resolve to G7 in bar 11. Now the first thing that you'll want to try is what T-Bone Walker did in the first place. Instead of thinking C minor 7, he was really thinking E flat major 6. That's the original chord there. And you can see how that would work, right? They're the same chord after all. They are literally just inversions of one another. And it's kind of up to the bass player to determine which one we're going to go for. Because even if we were just playing this E flat 6, we're hearing the E flat as if it's the root, but the bass player might come in and supersede that and play a C in the bass. Now we're hearing C minor 7 as the harmony. So E flat major 6 and C minor 7, they're relatives, right? Not only the same thing, but you want to be thinking in the key of E flat major, C minor is your relative minor. So they're truly interchangeable. Really important to be able to twig that stuff, especially for lead playing, because it means you can play your C minor licks over an E flat major 6th chord, and it's going to sound awesome. So let's demo that. So you've got A minor 7 to E flat 6, and back to the G7. Sounds really sweet. Now if we're using E flat 6, we can also take that a step further and try the 6-9 chord, one of my favourites, the Django chord. And again, you can determine whether you want the top E string involved or not. Works really well either way. A minor 7 to E flat 6-9. Bring that top string in, G7. Very sophisticated sounding. Now let's look at another option. If this was a jazz blues, what we'd be playing here would be A minor 7, and then a D7, right? Because this would be like a 2-5 going to the 1. So we can run with that idea and get something really interesting happening. We can think 2-5, but instead of 5 here, go tritone sub of that. So instead of D7, A flat 7. Again, look at that, just a glorified sidestep from the semitone above where you want to end up. really good. You've also got the option of that Beatlesy dominant 7 voicing. Sounds extra spicy. Now what about we go back to thinking of A minor 7 to C minor 7, but we treat this as if it's a 2, 5. So in a world where C minor 7 is functioning as 2, F7 is going to be the 5. And that's going to climb up to the G7 really nicely. This is what people call the backdoor progression or the backdoor dominant, which really is nothing but a 4 minor inverted, because it's like a C minor 6, which would be the 4 minor, but with F in the bass. So very similar thing. You can take the same approach playing over these things as well. So that might sound something like this. Works really well. Or a bigger F7 voicing if we want. Whatever you prefer. Or again, what about the Beatles dominant 7 voicing? Now the final chord that we'll substitute is the A minor 7 that started that same progression. Let's go with the T-Bone Walker original, D9 sus, or C over D you could call this, because it's a C major triad with D in the bass. And again, you can choose whether you want the top E string involved or not. That's going to connect really nicely to that E flat 6-9 if you want to lift, or it can descend really nicely to that E flat 6. Depends which direction you want to be hearing the voice leading travel. The cool thing with these voicings, things like this, or the A minor 7 that it replaced, is it opens up all that double stop Hendrixy, soul, Motown, Curtis Mayfield sort of stuff that I've featured in so many of my lessons. Use as much of that as you like on those chords. Now the final progression we're going to look at is the turnaround that occurs in the last 2 bars. So the obvious choice, 1, 4, 1, 5, that augmented chord, which so beautifully pulls us back to bar number 1, resolving on the G7. That little walk up to the augmented is always nice. Doing it with a bit of a triplet feel. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, and a 3, and a 4. If you were going to end after that, it'd be nice to end maybe on the G9. That would sound pretty cool. You could walk down to it from the D augmented. Now a really fancy option to finish off with, full of really complicated secondary dominant tritone chord substitutions and quantum physics and all that, holographic universe, Michael Talbot, Carl Sagan, Roger Penrose, get all those fellas involved, but look how simple it is. Just dragging the same shape around the fretboard. So all we're doing, G13, drag it 3 frets higher, B flat 13, start to descend chromatically, A13, G sharp 13, resolving back home, G13. Sounds really fancy, but it's dead basic. If we did want to try and understand it theoretically, we could say that this came from a 1-6-2-5 type of turnaround progression, where we took the 6, tritone subbed it, the 2, changed the quality of the chord from minor to dominant, and then the 5, tritone subbed it, and then resolved to the 1. Okay, Okay, and there we have it, a deep dive into Stormy Monday, one of the blues standards that you really should know if you ever intend to go out to jam sessions or play with other people. Now, as you might have gathered, this one requires a little more finesse for playing lead over. Just the pentatonic scale ain't going to quite cut it on this one, so we'll get into that in a future lesson. Okay guys, so please do me the favour of commenting, liking and subscribing and sharing this video. That stuff makes such a big difference to the future of this channel. Without that kind of interaction, the channel will sadly just fade into obscurity. Also, for less than the cost of a cup of coffee, you can become a member of this channel, which is just a nice little way to show your support for the work that I do here. Okay, so on to some tone talk. I'm using my newly acquired Novo Myris J guitar, which I've fallen in love with. Really classy, semi-hollow guitar with a bit of a Jazzmaster vibe, kind of like a cross between a Jazzmaster and a Rickenbacker visually. Brilliantly constructed, really nicely set up, Fralin P90s, mastery trem. What could go wrong? And I'm plugged directly into my 1969 Fender Deluxe Reverb. Just using the reverb on there, running the volume pretty low, got the reverb on about 3, just such a great sounding amp. Right, well, thanks for joining me guys. As always, it's an absolute pleasure to spend some time with you, with a crowd of people so passionate about guitar and music. It's really great to see. Take care of yourselves and I'll see you next week.